From bizarre airborne moments to full-speed slams into unforgiving barriers, Formula One champions have endured crashes that make the heart stop and the breath catch. Over the decades, even the most skilled drivers, the names etched into motorsport history, have faced incidents that could have ended it all in the blink of an eye. This journey climbs the ladder of chaos, starting with strange but survivable moments and building toward career-changing impacts that remind everyone why Formula One will always carry an edge of danger. Nico Rosberg, Abu Dhabi 2012, the unexpected flight. Some crashes announce themselves with screeching tires or tense battles for position. Others arrive out of nowhere, blindsiding everyone watching. Nico Rosberg's day in Abu Dhabi 2012 was shaping up to be frustrating, not frightening. An early collision had forced a pit stop for a new front wing, leaving him down in 20th, far from the action at the sharp end of the grid. As Rosberg closed on Narain Karthikeyan's HRT, the scene looked routine. Then, in an instant, it turned into something out of a nightmare. Karthikeyan suffered a sudden hydraulic failure, forcing him to slow dramatically right as Rosberg was about to overtake. The timing couldn't have been worse. Rosberg's Mercedes slammed into the back of the slowing HRT, launching itself high into the air like a missile. The world seemed to hang in silence for a split second, then the car crashed back to earth in a cloud of sparks and debris. The miracle: the Mercedes didn't flip, and both drivers climbed out, shaken but unhurt. In a sport where even a small misjudgment can be fatal, Rosberg's airborne escape remains one of the strangest survivals in F1 history. From the moment of impact, it looked more like an aircraft takeoff than a racing incident. The nose of Rosberg's car shot upward, the rear wheels lifting clear off the tarmac as the suspension stretched to its limit. For a heartbeat, the car seemed to hang there, suspended against the blue Abu Dhabi sky, before gravity took over. The landing was violent. The chassis slammed into the ground, bottoming out with a crunch that echoed across the circuit. Sparks sprayed from underneath as the floor scraped along the asphalt, leaving a glowing trail in its wake. Karthikeyan, still coasting his stricken HRT, glanced in his mirrors to see the chaos unfolding just meters behind him. Marshals on the barriers flinched, hands halfway to their radios before the car had even landed. In the Mercedes garage, engineers froze mid-sentence, their eyes fixed on the monitor. The replays revealed how little time Rosberg had to react. 1 second, clear track. The next, a stationary car right in his path. That neither car barrel rolled nor collided with another competitor was pure fortune. When Rosberg finally unbuckled and stepped out, the dust and heat shimmering off the wreckage, the crowd's applause was as much relief as admiration. It was a crash that defied expectations of what should have happened, and for those watching, it was a reminder that in Formula One, danger doesn't always come with warning signs. Sebastian Vettel and Kimi Räikkönen, Singapore 2017, the wet weather domino effect. Street circuits have a reputation for chaos, but throw in rain, and things can turn ugly before the first corner. The 2017 Singapore Grand Prix began under exactly those conditions, and with Sebastian Vettel on pole, the two Red Bulls lurking behind, and Kimi Räikkönen starting just behind them, the stage was set for tension. As the lights went out, the drama hit immediately. Max Verstappen launched well, Vettel swerved to cover him, and Räikkönen surged forward from the left. The three lines converged, metal met metal, and all hell broke loose. Räikkönen was pitched sideways into Verstappen, then slammed into Vettel. The carnage didn't stop there. Moments later, Vettel spun off into the barriers, his Ferrari crippled. The race had barely begun, but three big names were already out. It wasn't the fastest crash in this list, but the sheer chaos and the fact it wiped out a third of the title contenders before turn one makes it unforgettable. The wet conditions added an extra layer of unpredictability, with spray from the cars ahead reducing visibility to almost nothing. From the overhead camera, the sequence looked like a slow-motion domino effect, Räikkönen's Ferrari sliding into Verstappen's Red Bull, which in turn bounced into Vettel's car. The sound was a sharp series of impacts, each one echoing off the concrete walls lining the narrow track. In the cockpit, drivers were thrown against their harnesses as carbon fiber splintered into the air. Räikkönen's car, crippled by the initial hit, skated across the slick tarmac and into the side of Verstappen again, sealing both their fates before they'd even reached the first braking zone. Vettel, still leading at this point, was fighting to keep his damaged car in a straight line, the rain making it impossible to find grip. Just a few hundred meters later, His rear snapped around, sending the red Ferrari nose first into the barriers in a spray of sparks. Marshals braved the slippery surface to rush toward the wrecks, while mechanics back in the garages stood motionless, watching their championship hopes dissolve on the big screens. The team radios told the story of disbelief, frustrated sighs, clipped confirmations of damage, and the cold reality that the race was over for all three. In the stands, fans stared in disbelief. This wasn't just a crash, it was a title fight detonating in the opening seconds. When the dust settled, the starting grid that had promised one of the fiercest battles of the season was already a memory, replaced by the quiet roll of recovery trucks under yellow flags. Kimi Räikkönen, Silverstone 2014, the Iceman meets the wall. Kimi Räikkönen has built a reputation as the calmest man in the paddock, but even the Iceman's composure must have been tested by his Silverstone shunt in 2014. As the field roared onto the Wellington Straight, Räikkönen lost control on the exit of Aintree Corner. At full racing speed, he careered off the track, slammed into the barriers, and ricocheted back into the path of oncoming cars. The force of the impact was staggering, measured at over 47 G. Debris flew, marshals sprinted, and somehow Räikkönen emerged from the wreckage with only a bruised ankle and leg. The barriers, on the other hand, were destroyed and required an hour-long repair. It was a crash that showed just how thin the line is between walking away and disaster. The moment the rear end twitched, there was no recovery. The Ferrari skidded onto the grass, the suspension jolting violently as the car bounced over uneven ground before meeting the barrier with a bone-jarring hit. Carbon fiber panels burst away like shrapnel, scattering into the runoff and onto the circuit itself. In the split second after the impact, Räikkönen's Ferrari spun back across the track, a terrifying sight for the pack hurtling toward him at full speed. Several drivers darted left and right, narrowly avoiding what could have been a catastrophic secondary collision. On the pit wall, mechanics from every team leaned forward, eyes fixed on the spot where the car had finally come to rest. The damage to the barriers was so extensive that marshals and track workers swarmed the area, replacing sections of steel and absorbing the eerie quiet that lingered over the straight. Replays captured the sheer violence of the crash, the way Räikkönen's head snapped forward and back before the cockpit safety structures absorbed the rest of the energy. When he climbed out, limping but otherwise intact, fans erupted into cheers, relief mixed with amazement that such a colossal shunt had left the Iceman standing. Lewis Hamilton, Nürburgring 2007, the rookie wake-up call. Long before becoming a 7-time world champion, Lewis Hamilton was a rookie chasing pole position at the Nürburgring. In Q3, he pushed hard into turn 8, committed, precise, until fate intervened. At over 170 miles per hour, his right front tire exploded. In an instant, the car speared into the gravel, hammering into the barriers with sickening force. Marshals and medics rushed in. Hamilton, lying back in the cockpit, could be seen moving his legs, a quick check to see if anything was broken. Within minutes, he was in the medical car, headed to hospital. By the end of the day, against all expectations, he was cleared to race on Sunday. It was the kind of crash that reminds rookies and veterans alike that in Formula One, there's no such thing as untouchable. From the moment the tire burst, the car's fate was sealed. The front end dipped violently, spitting up a shower of sparks and gravel as it hurtled offline. Inside the cockpit, Hamilton's helmet jolted with the initial blow, his steering wheel a useless weight in his hands. The gravel trap offered little resistance, the momentum carrying the car deep into the runoff before the barriers delivered the final, brutal stop. The sound was a metallic crunch followed by the hollow silence that always hangs after a big shunt. Fans in the stands leaned forward, scanning for any sign of movement, their applause breaking only when Hamilton flexed his knees to test himself. The marshals worked quickly, securing the car and guiding the medical team in. The replay showed the exact moment the tire shredded, a blur of rubber and debris spinning away from the rim, followed by the helpless slide that no amount of driver skill could correct. Back in the garage, McLaren engineers studied the monitors, their expressions caught between concern and disbelief that such a freak failure had happened in the heat of qualifying. By the time Hamilton returned later that evening, the paddock buzzed with equal parts relief and respect. Walking back into the garage, helmet in hand, he wore the look of someone who had just been reminded that even the brightest careers can face darkness in an instant. Jenson Button, Monaco 2003, the tunnel nightmare. The Monaco Grand Prix is famous for its glamour, but its streets are brutal. In 2003, during practice, Jenson Button found that out in terrifying fashion. Exiting the tunnel at 180 miles per hour, the car stepped out, and the next moment it was hammering into the barriers. The impact knocked Button unconscious instantly. His car sat crumpled in the middle of the track and medics rushed in, pulling him from the wreckage. Button regained consciousness within minutes, but he spent the night in hospital as a precaution. He missed the race that weekend, but considering the violence of the crash, the fact he was even able to talk to reporters afterwards was a victory in itself. From the moment the rear of the car snapped in the tunnel, there was no chance to recover. The sudden shift from the enclosed, echoing darkness into the blinding daylight made the crash feel even more violent, the silver flashes of the guardrails whipping past before everything stopped in an explosion of sparks and carbon fiber. The sound was like metal tearing under immense pressure, followed by a hollow thud as the car came to rest. Track marshals sprinted toward him, their whistles cutting through the stunned silence of the crowd. The replays showed just how hard the impact had been. The front suspension buckled instantly, the nose wedged into the barriers at an awkward angle that made extraction tricky. Inside the helmet, Button's head tilted forward, motionless, his gloves limp against the steering wheel. When the medics arrived, they worked with deliberate urgency, securing his neck and carefully lifting him out under the watchful eyes of the team. The medical car pulled away to scattered applause from fans who had been holding their breath. Later, when news came that he was awake and talking, relief swept through the paddock. Even in a place where risk is an accepted part of the spectacle, that crash was a stark reminder of how quickly the glamour of Monaco can turn into a moment of pure fear. Fernando Alonso, Brazil, 2003, the podium nobody collected. The 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix was a storm-soaked demolition derby. Cars spun and crashed all afternoon, but the defining moment came on lap 54. Mark Webber lost control of his Jaguar, smashing into the barriers and showering the track with debris. Most drivers slowed to navigate through the mess, but Alonso, unsighted in the spray, plowed straight into a loose tire at full speed. The hit was brutal. Alonso's car speared into the wall, scattering parts across the track. He sat motionless for a moment before slowly climbing out, clearly in pain but miraculously conscious. The chaos brought out the red flag, and in a strange twist, the results were rolled back a lap, giving Alonso a podium finish he couldn't collect in person. The scene in real time was a blur of water spray, flying debris, and flashing yellow lights. The heavy rain reduced visibility to almost nothing, so Alonso's arrival into the carnage was like a train bursting out of fog with no warning. When the car struck the stationary tire, the force lifted the front wheels into the air for a split second before the chassis slammed into the barrier. Pieces of bodywork sprayed into the grandstand's catch fencing, the sound of tearing carbon fiber mixing with the roar of the storm. The cockpit cameras shook violently, then went black, heightening the uncertainty over his condition. Medics rushed in, their bright orange suits stark against the gray of the wet track. Alonso's slow movements inside the car were a relief, but the way he clutched his side told its own story. Around the paddock, engineers stared at the monitors, some already convinced the day's race would be stopped. When he finally stepped out, leaning on a marshal for support, the crowd erupted in applause, grateful to see him standing. The irony that he had secured a podium without even taking the checkered flag was a strange silver lining, a reminder that in Formula One, results can hinge on moments of chaos as much as moments of brilliance. Max Verstappen, Silverstone 2021, the 51G title flashpoint. The 2021 season between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton was already tense when they arrived at Silverstone. From the first lap, the battle was fierce. Hamilton hounded Verstappen through the opening corners, slipstreaming down the straight toward Copse. At 180 miles per hour, the two cars went side by side into one of the fastest corners in Formula One. The space ran out. Verstappen's Red Bull clipped the barrier with a deafening crash. The G-force recorded at an astonishing 51. The crowd fell silent, waiting for movement. Seconds later, Verstappen climbed out, stunned, angry, but alive. It was a championship flashpoint and one of the heaviest crashes in recent memory. What made the moment so electrifying and terrifying was the sheer violence hidden in the blur of speed. Onboard footage showed Verstappen's hands gripping the wheel in a split-second struggle to keep the car steady before the inevitable impact came. The rear snapped, the nose darted toward the barriers, and the collision erupted in a spray of debris and carbon shards. The wall shuddered under the hit, while Verstappen's car bounced back onto the runoff like a lifeless shell. In the stands, Red Bull fans stood frozen, their cheers swallowed by the sudden quiet. Hamilton's radio crackled with heavy breathing as his own adrenaline settled, while Verstappen's voice came through short, clipped, and laced with shock. Marshals were on the scene within seconds, waving yellow flags furiously as medical crews scrambled. The replays left no doubt about the scale of the crash, the angle of the impact, the speed, the exact moment the suspension exploded into fragments. In the paddock, conversation shifted instantly from championship strategy to relief that this hadn't been a fatal blow. For Verstappen, walking away unaided wasn't just a testament to the halo and modern safety measures. It was a defiant statement that the title fight was far from over. The atmosphere that Sunday didn't just feel like a race, it felt like a battle with no truce in sight. Fernando Alonso, Australia, 2016. The barrel roll from hell. Albert Park is no stranger to drama, but nothing could have prepared fans for what happened in 2016 between Fernando Alonso and Esteban Gutierrez. On lap 17, Alonso opened his DRS to overtake, but a misjudged move turned into disaster. His McLaren clipped the Haas, launching into the air in a violent barrel roll before slamming into the barriers and disintegrating into twisted wreckage. Silence hung over the track. Then, incredibly, Alonso emerged from the debris, shaken but walking, a miracle of modern safety standards. The slow-motion replays told a story almost too extreme to believe. The car's nose dug into the grass, flipping the McLaren skyward like a paper plane caught in a gust. Pieces of carbon fiber spun away in every direction, bouncing across the gravel before vanishing into the safety fencing. For a moment, it was impossible to even recognize the wreck as a Formula One car, just a tangled skeleton of metal and rubber lying awkwardly by the barrier. Medics ran at full speed, ducking through the debris field as marshals worked to control the scene. In the grandstands, fans stood frozen, hands covering their mouths. Even the commentary box fell into stunned silence, the usual rapid analysis replaced by sheer disbelief. Alonso, still strapped into what remained of the cockpit, paused before moving, as if running a mental check to confirm that his body still worked. Then came the moment of relief, a figure slowly climbing out, removing his helmet and waving faintly to the crowd. His race suit was streaked with dirt and shards of carbon, and his expression carried a mix of shock and defiance. Back in the paddock, drivers who had seen the replay could only shake their heads at the violence of the crash. It was the kind of incident that, decades earlier, might have ended in tragedy, but on that day in Melbourne, it became yet another example of how far safety in Formula One had come. Michael Schumacher, Silverstone 1999, the career-changing break. Michael Schumacher's crash at the title hopes for the season. It was a reminder that even the greatest are still at the mercy of mechanical failure. What made the scene, waving frantically for the medical team as Schumacher sat back in his seat, jaw clenched. Any attempt to lift himself was met with a grimace that told the full story. Fans who had come to see the great champion push the limits were suddenly confronted with the fragility of the sport they loved. In the pits, silence fell over the Ferrari garage, engineers watching the live feed with expressions of disbelief. The stretcher was brought out quickly, and the sight of Schumacher being carefully lifted from the cockpit was enough to drain the color from the faces in the crowd. Even rival teams stood at the pit wall, watching in concern, knowing how much the sport owed to drivers like him. As the ambulance pulled away, the reality set in. The season had just lost one of its fiercest competitors. Relief etched on fans' faces in the background. Team principal Jean Todt spoke of Schumacher's frustration at not being able to contribute on track, even as he began the long recovery process. Rumors swirled over whether he would be able to return before the season's end, each one feeding the anticipation of a comeback. His absence reshaped the dynamics of the championship battle, opening opportunities for rivals who might never have stood a chance otherwise. When he eventually did return later in the season, it wasn't just the speed that fans noticed. It was the unshakable determination in his driving, forged in the moment his car slammed into that Silverstone wall. Every one of these crashes could have ended far worse. The champions who walked away, or were carried away, owe their lives to the relentless march of safety innovation in Formula One. These moments are not just highlights of danger, but proof that even at the sport's highest level, nothing is guaranteed once the visor drops. And for those who watch, it's a sobering reminder. The line between glory and disaster is measured in fractions of a second. If these jaw-dropping moments kept you glued to the screen, there's a whole world of Formula One chaos waiting to be explored. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be ready for the next deep dive into the stories that make this sport unforgettable.